So we are in a series called Rerouting to God's Eternal Joy, which is a great series title. And we're looking at different aspects of joy. And today we're looking at the reroute called Unmet Longings. The theme of our series is joy. And joy is not the same as happiness or pleasure. Joy is distinct. It's eternal. It's not dependent on happiness. It's this shalom, this peace that lives inside of you. And rerouting is what happens when you're driving, and not so much anymore because we all have iPhones and stuff, but we used to have the TomTom, sitting on our dash, and the GPS lady, when she thought you made a wrong turn or missed something or there's an accident or a signal ahead, she would say, rerouting. And she would move you to some back road or something to get you where you needed to go. Well, one time I was driving home from Texas and I'm going up the 8, and there are very few more kind of desolate places than driving on the 8. It's a 2-lane freeway, and you would just go through the middle of the desert. And you would see this giant billboard, and it would say, now entering so-and-so town. And less than like a minute later, you'd see a big billboard that says, now leaving so-and-so town. And not a building was in sight. But I was driving, and it was getting kind of late, and I asked the GPS to reroute me to the nearest hotel. And so I get off the freeway, and I'm driving down a couple country dirt roads, and she says, now arriving at your destination. And there was nothing there. Just an empty lot in the middle of the desert. So I'm just kind of keep driving, assuming at some point I'm going to run into something. And I get to a stop sign, and like 10 cars go zooming past. And I figured, well, they know where they're going. They're probably heading to some kind of civilization, and maybe I can get somewhere to go to sleep. So I'm following. And as I'm driving, I keep passing these homemade signs that just say cowboy party with an arrow pointing. And so I'm like, okay, well, this is getting more exciting. And I pull up to this barn in the middle of nowhere with the only thing I can describe it as is a cowboy party. And it was one of the best nights of my life. Rerouting. God does this in our lives because he wants to bring us to real joy, to eternal joy. But the roads we keep taking just won't get us there. And occasionally his rerouting involves some painful detours for some of us. Reroute number 1 we looked at last week when Seth talked about shattered dreams. And rerouting number 2, what we're looking at today, it's the reroute of unmet longings. The title is Unmet Longings. The first 2 unmet longings I think about are emptiness and loneliness. And we're going to get to loneliness in a couple weeks when Seth is back. But joy is complex. And this is kind of where our analogy kind of breaks down a little bit, because sometimes we need to take multiple routes simultaneously to get to joy. But the first definition of joy that Seth presented last week is certainty. And discovering this joy involves the back road of shattered dreams. And the second definition of joy that we're looking at today is hunger. And discovering this joy involves the back road of unmet longings. My wife is a planner. She's a little type A, but she's also an idealist. So whenever we do anything as a family, she envisions this just beautiful day. It's full of rainbows and cotton candy, where birds will flutter in the open window and dress our kids for us, where our dog will go and bag up his own mess in the backyard so no one will step on it. And there won't be a single car in line to get into Disneyland. It's a perfect existence in her head. Well, we have 3 kids, and it's rarely perfect. Most of the time, I'm ready to go home, and we haven't even left the house yet. But as soon as the day doesn't go as planned, Jessica is confused because things did not go the way she saw it in her head. Well, when life falls short and things don't happen the way we assume they should happen, we feel some level of emptiness. We don't have the fulfillment that we assumed we would get. And to make matters worse, what's confusing about unmet longings, like emptiness, as far as I can tell, there are kind of 4 different kinds of emptiness, 4 different causes of emptiness. Yet they can feel almost identical. So it can be hard to decipher what's going on. And 2 kinds of this emptiness are self-inflicted, meaning we are the culprit of our own feeling empty. On the flip side, there are 2 kinds of emptinesses that are actually redemptive. And in all honesty, we should throw a party when we feel these kinds of emptiness. It means that we're on the right path. We're on the right road. So the 4 types of emptiness. Emptiness number 1 is chasing illegitimate pleasure, chasing counterfeit routes, or trying to build your own road to legitimate pleasures. It leads to a growing emptiness. The hole in the soul gets deeper. And what can end up happening is addiction, drugs, alcohol, porn, affairs, smoking, overeating, whatever. But emptiness also results from these kind of sneaky, illegitimate pleasures that you wouldn't think of. Things like gossip, being critical, seeing yourself as superior to someone important to you. These are self-inflicted emptinesses. Emptiness is meant to be a doorway of the soul that creates hunger. Emptiness is meant to reroute us to hunger for something more. Thomas Costain in The Three Edwards, his history book, he describes the life of Reynold III, a 14th century duke in what is now Belgium. He was grossly overweight. Reynold was commonly called by his Latin nickname Crassus, which simply just means fat. And say what you want to say about our modern world, we've gotten way better at insults in the last 700 years. But after a violent quarrel, Reynold's younger brother, Edward, led a successful revolt against him. And Edward captured Reynold, but he didn't kill him. Instead, he built a room around Reynold in the Newkirk Castle. And he promised him he could retain his title and his property as soon as he was able to leave the room. Now, this would not have been difficult for most people because we've seen the movie Winnie the Pooh. But the room had several windows and a door of near normal size, and none of them were locked or blocked. The problem was Reynold's size. To regain his freedom, he needed to lose weight. But Edward knew his older brother. And each day he sent a variety of delicious foods. And instead of dieting his way out of prison, Reynold grew bigger. And when Duke Edward was accused of cruelty, he had a ready answer. He said, "My brother is not a prisoner. He may leave when he wills to." And Reynold stayed in that room for 10 years and wasn't released until after Edward, his brother, died. But his health was so bad that he ended up dying within a year later. He was a prisoner of his own appetite. Emptiness number 2 is chasing lesser desires, in the belief that a lesser desire will fill me up. I think of the man that puts his wife on a pedestal that she can never live up to. Or the mother that thinks her little angel could never, ever do anything wrong. Or the businessman that works 80 hours a week seeking promotion after promotion. The family that just needs the bigger house on the street. The person that spends months on end backpacking through Europe to find themselves. This is a self-inflicted emptiness. When we get married, often we drop God out of the number 1 chair in our hearts, and we put the newlywed spouse in there instead. We do the same thing with the birth of our firstborn, or the first real joy you experience, the promotion, the new house, the great vacation spot, whatever. But none of those things can ever bring us true, lasting joy. And so we end up empty inside, seeking the next thing to fill us up. Well, the next two forms of emptiness, they'll sneak by unnoticed if you aren't paying attention. For some people, you may not be experiencing the first two forms of emptiness. You aren't struggling with any kind of addiction. You're not putting people up on a pedestal in your life, and yet you're laying in bed at night and you feel like something is missing. Well, emptiness number 3 is what I'm going to call homesickness. It's the inevitable result of living in our fallen world. Why? Well, the world just cannot fill me up. It's not enough. Why? Because we're just not home yet. Remember the first time I spent the night with my cousins, Drew and Taylor? We had the best time. I was a little kid, and we played in the backyard, and we played video games for hours, and we explored down by the creek, and it was just this fun, exhausting day. And then bedtime came. And all of a sudden, I was just overwhelmed. I was completely homesick. I needed my mom. I needed my bed. I needed my home. And so in what felt like the middle of the night, but was probably like 8:15, I got picked up and taken back home. When we recognize that we live in a broken world, when we experience the emptiness of longing for our true home, this emptiness is redemptive and not self-inflicted. It's a good thing. It's meant to create a hunger inside of me. A hunger for something other than what this world can offer. A hunger to know God. And a hunger to reflect him to others by how I live and how I relate to them. And then we have emptiness number 4, which I'm going to call introspection. As people, we are designed by God to be like a kitchen spout. And when the kitchen spigot is turned off, no water can flow through the pipe out to drink or clean or fill a pot to boil water. God has designed us to have his water flow through us to others. But when we turn off our spigot by pulling into ourselves, we become more obsessed with how we're doing than how someone else is doing. We've just turned off that joy spigot in our heart. But this emptiness is also redemptive. It's a good emptiness. It's meant to remind us, or maybe to jar us, to a deeper hunger. A hunger to relate to others like God does. A deeper hunger to be used by him to make a difference with people in their lives. So let's look how these dynamics play out with the man who had everything. We're going to be looking at the words of Solomon, the book of Ecclesiastes. And look how he starts off the entire book. The very beginning, the first thing he says to us, Ecclesiastes 1:1. It says, the words of the teacher, son of David, king of Jerusalem. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. Okay, this is the wisest man to ever live. And he said, everything a heart could desire was at his fingertips. And Solomon tried some of the things you and I tried to fill our emptiness, to make sense of life. But no matter what he tried, he eventually discovered that his efforts fell short. They didn't last. They didn't drive deep enough into his soul, to his very heart. The effect was a sense of meaninglessness. So how did Solomon attempt to fill his emptiness inside? Well, one way was pleasure on demand. It says he seeks to fill his emptiness with pleasures. Ecclesiastes 2:1. I thought in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find what is good. So he begins with this thesis. Let's see if pleasure will fill me up. In other words, trust your heart. If I want it, if it feels good, it must be good. And so he did. For years, he sought joy through pleasure. And here's what he concludes. Continuing Ecclesiastes 2:1, but that also proved to be meaningless. When he'd finished, he concluded emptiness, loneliness. When we attempt to fill an inner emptiness with an outer pleasure, we're just not successful. Did you find that even the best pleasures you've ever had, that they eventually fell short? They didn't last long enough. They didn't drive deep enough into your heart. And so what do? We seek bigger and better, but it's never enough. And much to his surprise, Solomon discovered the same thing. Ecclesiastes 2:2, laughter, I said, is foolish. And what does pleasure accomplish? And 2:3, I tried cheering myself with wine, embracing folly. My mind still guided me with wisdom. I wanted to see what was worthwhile for men to do under heaven during the very few days of their lives. So what does Solomon do in order to try and bring pleasure to his life? Well, cheering himself with wine was one of them. And it says embracing folly, meaning finding delight in what is forbidden. And my favorite part of that, he says, my mind is still guiding me with wisdom, meaning I'm trying to be smart about it. And don't we love that? He says, I do this all the time. I know it didn't work out for them, but I'm smarter. I got this figured out, right? Well, I don't know about you guys, but I'm not as smart as I think I am. So he tried two worldly ways while attempting to still be guided with wisdom, and failed miserably. So having tried forbidden pleasures, he now tries legitimate ones. Ecclesiastes 2:4, I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. How successful do you think these efforts were in filling his emptiness? But we do the same thing. The bigger house, the faster car, my name in lights. And then Solomon goes into three main motivators that seem to captivate the heart of man more than any other. He goes for money, sex, and power. We're going to look at just a few snippets from his diary. Ecclesiastes 2:7, I bought male and female slaves, and other slaves were born in my house. 2:7 continues, I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. And 2:8, I amassed silver and gold for myself, the treasure of kings and provinces. And 2:8 continues, I acquired men and women singers, and a harem sell as well the delights of the heart of men. So Solomon had more stuff than anyone could imagine. He had amassed power more than any man before him. And Solomon tried to fill his emptiness and loneliness with sex and women, 1,000 women to be exact. How successful do you think his efforts were? He says, meaningless, meaningless. It turns out the feeling of emptiness is too great for men's greatest efforts. We'll continue in Solomon's diary in 2:9. I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. In all this, my wisdom stayed with me. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my work, and this was the reward for all my labor. He's painting a picture here for us. There's nothing that we can do to fill the emptiness inside. Didn't work for Solomon. He had everything. He tried everything. If anyone could fill that void through human effort, it was this man. At the end of this life, look what he says in 2:11. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done, and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless. A chasing after the wind, nothing was gained under the sun. Every man's greatest effort to fill himself up, to feel this gnawing sense of emptiness, will never be enough, will never last long enough, and will never be deep enough. In our entertainment-oriented culture, it's easy to imagine that performing on stage in front of thousands of people would make your life complete. Well, Dallas Holm, the Christian musician, once said in Contemporary Christian magazine, he says, quote, "I have young artists who come up to me and say, if I don't get to do what you are doing, then I will never be happy. And I have to say that to them, then you will never be happy. Happiness isn't based on what you do, it's based on who you are in Him. Living for ourselves, even in the guise of living for others, like our kids, it's not big enough. The stage is not big enough. The stakes are not high enough. And the impact is not deep enough. Because joy is the hunger for a primary relationship with God. And then to reflect Him in this world by my life and how I relate to people." Solomon's diary is devastating, but that's the point. Solomon attempted to find meaning without having to depend on God and through his own efforts, with his own talents, with his gift, with his own relationships. He did it in the words of the great prophet Frank Sinatra, he did it my way. The natural result of every endeavor was, as Solomon put it, meaningless. Meaningless. Everything is meaningless. Which leads us to just two options. Number one is hopelessness, which at best leaves us with just making do. Life, I'll just never be satisfied. I'm just going to go through the motions. And hopelessness can lead to cynicism, can cause us to become withdrawn, can lead us to depression, for some suicide. What's the point of living? It's all hopeless. Or it can lead you to hunger for something greater. In the Antarctic summer of 1908, Sir Ernest Shackleton and 3 of his companions attempted to travel to the South Pole from their winter quarters. They set off with 4 ponies to help carry all the load. Well, weeks later, their ponies died, rations all but exhausted. They turned back towards their base, their goal not accomplished. Altogether, they trekked 127 days. And on their return journey, as Shackleton records in the heart of the Antarctic, the time was spent talking about food, elaborate feasts, gourmet delights, long menus. And as they staggered along, suffering from dysentery, not knowing whether they'd survive, every waking hour was occupied with thoughts of eating. They hungered like no other. Hunger. The unmet longings exposes our deeper hunger for what nothing in this world can satisfy. Unfortunately, our sin nature covers over that deep longing God places in our hearts. This includes a hunger to know God, not to know about God, but to truly know Him, to love God, not just the idea of Him, but to love our Creator who loved us first, to be used by God, to make a difference in people's lives, to put ourselves aside, to truly desire to help people, the people that God has put into our lives, our sphere of influence, as we call it. To love like God, to sacrificially give of your time and your talents and your treasures to those around you, so that we may experience a taste of God through it, so that they can experience a taste of God through us, and to become like Christ in our character and our values and our purpose. In the letters to Diognetus, which dates back to like the 2nd century BC, an anonymous writer describes a very strange people. He says, Christians are not differentiated from other people by country or language or customs. You see, they do not live in cities of their own or speak some strange dialect. They live in both Greek and foreign cities, wherever chance has put them. They follow local customs in clothing, food, and other aspects of life. But at the same time, they demonstrate to us the unusual form of their citizenship. They live in their own native lands, but as aliens. Every foreign country is to them as their native country. and every native land is a foreign country. They marry and have children just like everyone else, but they do not kill unwanted babies. They offer a shared table, but not a shared bed. They're passing their days on earth, but are citizens of heaven. They obey the appointed laws and go beyond the laws in their own lives. They love everyone, but are persecuted by all. They are put to death and gain life. They are poor and yet make many rich. They are dishonored and yet gain glory through dishonor. Their names are blackened and yet they are cleared. They are mocked and blessed in return. They are treated outrageously and behave respectful to others. When they do good, they are punished as evildoers. When punished, they rejoice as if being given new life. They are attacked by Jews as aliens and are persecuted by Greeks. Yet, those who hate them cannot give any reason for their hostility. After Solomon had exhausted every human freeway to joy, God reroutes him to the deeper hunger in his heart that can only be met by a primary and deep relationship with God. Ecclesiastes 12:1, remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the days of trouble come and the years approach when you will say, I find no pleasure in them. Solomon does not mean a casual, oh yeah, God is my Creator. I forgot about that. Remembering my Creator is to make God my first thing pleasure, my first thing priority, my first thing anchor, my first thing hope, my first thing love. Joy is found in hungering for a first thing relationship with God. 12:13 says, now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it's good or evil. Fear God and keep his commands. It's the whole duty of man, he says. What does it mean to fear God? Is that like, God, you're terrifying? I don't think so. I think in this context, it means three things. Fear God means to take him and his commands seriously. On the Fox River in Illinois, officials annually face an expensive problem. Of the roughly 600 buoys on the waterways, not one is expected to last an entire season. Each year, the attrition rate for these little plastic buoys is about 125%. What happens to them? Well, officials say that they're willfully smashed to pieces by vandals. Ironically, boaters are only hurting themselves and others because the buoys are there to provide safety and directions for the boaters. Some are no-wake zones where power boats must go much slower. Some show shallow areas where boats could get shored up or it's dangerous. And some show the mouthways to channels where it can also be dangerous. Like vandals smashing buoys, many people take great delight in running over the commands of God. The Bible calls this a spirit of lawlessness. God's commands are given for our safekeeping. Yet the sinful nature within us, it hates them nonetheless. 2, to fear God means to know that your sin will find you out. It reminds me of J. Alistair Brown. He writes, walking through a park, I passed a massive oak tree. A vine had grown up along its trunk, and the vine started small, nothing to bother about. But over the years, the vine had gotten taller and taller. And by the time I passed, the entire lower half of the tree was covered by the vine's creepers. The massive tiny feelers was so thick, the tree looked as though it had innumerable birds' nests in it. Now the tree was in danger. This huge solid oak was quite literally being taken over. The life was being squeezed from it. But the gardeners in that park had seen the danger. They'd taken a saw and severed the trunk of the vine, one neat cut across the middle. The tangled mass of the vine's branches still clung to the oak, but the vine was now dead. It would gradually become plain as weeks passed and the creepers began to die and fall away from the tree. How easy it is for sin, which begins so small and seemingly insignificant, to grow into a strangling grip on our lives. But sin's power is severed by Christ, and gradually as we yield daily to Christ, sin's grip dries up and falls away. To fear God is to know that every sin, though it can be forgiven, carries consequences. Makes me think of the nursery rhyme Humpty Dumpty. I've been in the preschool a lot the last couple of weeks. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty back together again. You guys remember that one? According to those who know such things, this piece of wisdom is a relic. It's thousands of years old. Versions have appeared in 8 European languages. But in its most primitive stages, Humpty Dumpty was a riddle. It asked the question, what, when broken, can never be repaired, not even by the strong or wise individuals? And the kids would answer, an egg. Because regardless of how hard we try, a broken egg can simply never be put together. We have to learn to live with the mess. Sin is the same way. Is there grace? Yes. Is there forgiveness? By the grace of God. But the stain remains. We all seek a presence in our lives, something that will fill our lives with satisfaction and joy. But what are you seeking it in? Some of us have sought it in our marriage. Many of us got married thinking that we've married the perfect companion and we're going to ride off blissfully into the sunset with happiness and joy, but are ultimately disappointed. That's because we're looking to marriage for something only God can give. The arms you sought in a romantic love were God's arms. The thrill you sought in drugs was his presence. The security and significance and soul delight you sought in money was found in him. If we find in ourselves a desire that nothing on earth can satisfy, the only explanation must be we're made for something else. Someone who has slipped beyond the plane of this world. God. The disciples, if you've read Acts, after Jesus left, their lives were hard. They were shipwrecked, beaten, despised, lied about, mistreated, but they had this amazing joy inside of them. Do we have that same kind of joy? What is your joy dependent on? The right circumstance, owning this, accomplishing this, being with this person, fill in the blank. In order to have joy, I must have ... Something I want us to chew on this week. Your ability to have joy in all things is the measure of how much you understand and believe the gospel. If you knew the treasure of the gospel, even when other parts of life go wrong, you're not devastated because you have something better than life itself. Someone punches you in the face, nothing happy about that. But if you knew how much Jesus has forgiven you, you're able to maintain joy even in the midst of a bloody nose. Because Jesus' forgiveness is a greater treasure to you. You don't lose your temper because you have joy in God. Our problem is not our ability to control our tempers. Our problem is how little Jesus and his forgiveness matters to us sometimes. Your stocks crash, nothing joyful about that. But if you knew how much Jesus had forgiven you of, if you're able to maintain joy in the midst of an economical tough time, because Jesus' forgiveness is greater treasure to you, you have joy. Your ability to have joy in all things is a measure of how much you understand the gospel. Because the disciples in the book of Acts and beyond become pretty unbelievable people. They're joyful and bold and zealous. But they didn't start that way. They were selfish and scared and unbelieving. Their joy, boldness, and zeal were the byproduct of anchoring their lives in the resurrection of Jesus. Where do you find certainty, or hope, purpose, presence? The disciples are no different than any of us. They'd simply anchored their lives in something that gave them joy in all things. So where do you anchor yours? Song says, my hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. He's the only rock you can build your life on that can never be moved. Depending on the statistics you read, roughly 60% of the homeless are addicts. Some police officers who've been working in Orange County for a number of years observed that there are all kinds of resources for homeless addicts. And the homeless addicts are willing to take whatever resources that are offered, but on one condition. They insist on not having to obey any rules or do anything at all in order to receive those resources. What God offers us the resources of joy and a hunger that can become joy. But like the homeless addict, we don't want God's resources as long as we can hold on to our own supposed freedom to define joy as we want. And our route to joy remains unchanged, which is why we have to reroute. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for the road of unmet longings. Lord, we pray that if we are seeking fulfillment and joy through filling emptiness, through man-made things, through pleasures here on earth, Lord, that you can help us to put a stop to that. Lord, if we're recognizing an emptiness inside of us, this hole in our hearts that can only be filled by you, Lord, I pray that we hunger for that. That we can seek joy through relationship with you. Lord, that we can just become that turned on spigot that will just pour the joy you give us into the people around us. Or just pray, Lord, if anybody here, if this is their first time hearing the gospel, Lord, that you will just allow them to receive you into their lives. That they will pray for forgiveness for sins and commit their lives to being filled with an everlasting source of joy. That the people in this building will know that they can have that no matter what's going on, because we are made for another place. That we have a Father that loves us, that is willing to shower us with joy all the time, as long as we're willing to receive it. We pray in Jesus' name, amen.